Nevertheless, we have a few of those deputies. But in the German Bundestag, there's only one person against the euro. This is quite different if you go and look at the European Parliament. In the European Parliament, my estimate is about 30% of those who are sitting in this parliament are against the euro. Not only those who come from non-euro countries, but also those, many of those, or some of those who are currently experiencing the euro. Some of them have now, and this is the first action, found themselves and put themselves together under a group called Freedom of Choice. And this is a group of MEPs of the European Parliament who come from EU countries, from Euro countries, who do not like the euro, who would like to discuss alternatives to the single currency. And we are meeting regularly, also next week again, every twice a month. And and some of the colleagues here you will hear today. Number two, yes, we do need alternatives. We do need to discuss alternatives because, as we all know, and you can probably hear this in the course of the day, not a single multi-currency system has ever survived in the history. So it is our strong opinion this will not survive either. So rather than being subject and victim to something which we can't control, I think it is the responsibility of this Parliament to discuss alternatives in time and make recommendations for alternatives. And this brings me to the next and last item. What immediate alternative would, for instance, the Alpha Partei, to which I belong, together with Herr Professor Starbatty, who will speak, Professor Lucke, Frau Trebesius, and Bernd Kölmel. We are the only party I know of in Europe which has a very precise recommendation when it comes to the next Greek crisis. By the way, we made also this recommendation when it came to the last Greek crisis. And this is very simple. We recommend, number one, Greece leaves the currency union. There's nothing new. A few others do this as well. Number two, we do believe we should make sure that at the same time, Germany and the other major creditor nations forego and forgive the debts, the credits which they gave so far. That is new. And this idea has never been presented to the Greek government itself. It is my humble opinion that had it been presented to Mr. Tsipras last time, he may have accepted the deal. He may have had a chance to go to his electorate and say, look, folks, I got something for getting out of the euro with all the advantages by devaluation and being more and getting higher competitiveness. We also got a forgiveness of the debts and guarantees which so far had been given by the creditor countries. Now you should say, some of the Germans here will say, well, why should we forgive the credits? Well, our position is very clear. The money is gone anyway. Because we don't know of a single credible economist in the world who believes that the money is not gone. They all believe it is gone, whereas the German politicians say it is coming back. And having myself managed a company for many years, I would say that if I have a debtor and I know he will not be able to pay his money back, I don't have this amount of credit in my balance sheet at 100%. Whereas Herr Schäuble, the finance minister, still has it at 100% in his balance sheet. So our proposal is very simple. Next time, let Greece go, pay for a very expensive exit ticket, but it looks only expensive. It is actually much cheaper than to continue with the current position. So much to my opening remarks. And now I would like to turn over the first session on Euro versus economics, and would like to ask Peter Klepper, who is the head of Open Europe Brussels, to take the lead in this discussion. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans Olaf. Good morning, everyone. I think this is a very timely conference, not only because it's been organized after last summer when Greece came very close to Grexit, given that the banking system was basically shut. It could have been a great opportunity to organize this, perhaps even resort Greece to Montenegro status, which would not have involved the changeover of the currency, but which would only need to have involved cutting off Greek banks from the ECB, which partly was already the case. But that path was not chosen. Now, this is also a great conference because it is organized by different groups in the European Parliament, which, in my opinion, I think is very important to go over these ideological boundaries. And indeed, we have a very good panel here with three speakers who are coming from different countries, two from a Eurozone country, France and Germany, one from Britain. Now, first, I'd like to give the word to Jacques Sapir. He is an economist and teaches at the French School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. He's an avid commentator, not only on the euro crisis, but certainly about that. Writes in Le Figaro often, has his own blog, Rus Europe. So I look forward to your contribution. If I just may ask to speak not much longer than 15 minutes, so then we have a lot of room for Q&A after and debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the first point is, of course, the first point is, of course, trying to assess the current situation of the European Monetary Union. It's absolutely obvious that right now the European Monetary Union is locked into a kind of austerity drive with considerable consequences, not just for some countries, and these consequences have been very well described on Greece, Portugal, Spain, but also, more generally speaking, on the whole of the EMU. It is extremely interesting to have a look on GDP since 1999, so the beginning of the euro, and to compare the GDP growth with non-euro countries, be they in Europe, like Great Britain, Sweden, Poland, or be they out of Europe, like the United States and Canada. First, the average rate of growth in the EMU has been around 1.1%. You know, it's very, very low growth. The much more when we compare to, let me say, Sweden, more than 2% of average growth, to United Kingdom, 1.9%, or to the United States, again, more than 2%. But what is much more important is to focus onto the average rate of growth since the financial crisis, so since the 2008 crisis. And then the average rate of growth has been nil. And if we retire Germany from the EMU, if we are trying to compute the EMU rate of growth without Germany, it has been minus 0.3% a year. Again, this is to be compared to the same figures for Sweden, 5.2% of average growth. United States, 2.6. Or even to the United Kingdom, 0.8. Now, there is another problem. It is not just growth which has been very heavily stricken by the euro. It's also investment. Investment, the global investment, has been definitely very low in the European Monetary Union. From 1999 to 2015, the average yearly rate of growth of investment has been nil, or more precisely, 0.1% a year. If we compute the same figures since 2008, now it's minus 0.5%. Again, this is to be compared with figures for Sweden, 2.2% since 2008, and nearly 3%, 2.9% since 1999, or to the United States, 1.2% from 1999, and the United Kingdom, 1.3% since 1999. So the first assessment is that the euro has created a kind of depressive environment in Europe, and particularly for countries from Southern Europe. The second point is the huge rise of criticism by some economists. You probably have read the extract from the Mervyn King books, which is to be published in Great Britain. I have the abstract of Joe Stiglitz's books, which is forthcoming by next May. And both these books are extremely documented and extremely virulent critics for the euro. By the way, the euro is now being criticized by a wide range of economists, from post-Keynesian leftist guy, from which I belong, up to liberal people. And there is a very good reason in that. Economists, whatever the theory on which they are predicating their works, are looking at reality, at least some economists. And the actual situation in the Eurozone is a definite disaster. The third point is the fact that we are facing right now another year of crisis and extremely difficult and painful bargaining into the European and Monetary Union. Professor Henkel has already spoken about the problem of the Brexit. We know that Greece is in a very difficult situation, and that without a new powerful help from other Eurozone countries, the Greek government will default by early July. But we have even Italy, which is right now in a very serious situation, and this is largely linked to the problem of the euro. So this is giving birth to a huge question. Could a major reform be implemented in the Eurozone? And the first point is what I've called the illusion of federalization. Let me state something very simple. I am not against the idea of federalization. Federalization is, for an economist, a possible solution for the crisis of the Eurozone. But the problem is that most people now speaking about federalization are not understanding and are not computing the real cost of federalization. Let me just make a simple comparison. We know that the net transfer in the European Union, not the Eurozone, just the European Union as a whole, is now 41 billion of euro a year. The net transfer which would be necessary to make federalization work is around 200 and 280 billion of euros inside the Eurozone. You could see from these figures that it's a quantum leap from the current situation to go to federalization. What is more, most of the cost of this transfer is to go down on the shoulder of Germany. It's absolutely obvious. And now the problem is not to say, well, German as bad guys, German doesn't want federalization. People, Germany, can't pay for this amount of money. It's absolutely obvious. This will destroy the economy of Germany. So, federalization is not a possible option. Now, we have, by the way, other stumbling blocks on the path of federalization, which are making federalization a dead end or a non-starter from the beginning. And let me ask, well, rhetorically, a question. Why the reform needed from the very beginning of the creation of the Eurozone, like a social union, like a fiscal union, like a kind of transfer budget large enough to cope with the effect of the euro. Why these reforms have not been implemented by 1999? I remember, not exactly in this room, but in this building, talking with people like Jean Pisani-Ferry, who were very, very deeply involved in the first move towards the euro in 1996 and 1997. And Jean Pisani-Ferry was by then saying, well, of course, the euro could not work without a social union and without a fiscal union. Okay? But could you make sure that these reforms will be pushed on against the will of government? And he told me, no. So I said to him, well, the euro has no chance at all to become a viable solution. And we are still in this situation. Now, what could be the solution? Of course, the best solution will be a coordinated breakup of the euro. A kind of breakup done by the Eurogroup himself, which, to some extent, would preserve the European Union of the deleterious impact of this breakup. And with this kind of breakup, we could agree between countries on different kind of fuels to have a more or less stable situation between countries. I would say more or less stable because some adjustment will be needed by different countries. Some countries will need to depreciate their currency. Some other countries will need to reevaluate their currencies. Okay, but at least that could be done in a kind of loosely organized system. The second solution will be uncoordinated breakup. And this kind of uncoordinated breakup is very probably what is to happen, if not this year, quite probably next year or even the year after. Now the problem of an uncoordinated breakup is that some countries will need to protect themselves from the deleterious effect of this breakup, and then this will have a very serious consequence onto the existence of the European Union. I'm not saying that the European Union is to disappear if the euro is to disappear. I didn't believe in that, but very certainly a major reform of the European Union will be needed. The last thing I want to say is that time is running short. It's absolutely obvious that right now governments are being overtaken by events, and to some aspect and to some effect, we could see a kind of major credit events beginning by the end of this year and affecting either Italy or France. I'm quite seriously looking at kind of important credit events onto France, and then we will be on the road of a kind of uncoordinated breakup of the euro. So if we want to avoid this solution, if we want to implement a kind of coordinated breakup that I am advocating, we have very few time behind. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sampi. Thank you also for respecting your time so correctly. Then I'd like to give the word to Professor Roland Vaubel, who's one of the most prominent classical liberal academics in Germany, has been publishing for years, has also been always linking this to insisting on subsidiarity at the European level. He's a professor at the University of Mannheim and also a member of the scientific advisory board of the German Economy Ministry. So please, Professor.
Well, as you all know, the Eurozone, the euro, has come under considerable stress. And this raises the question whether the Eurozone is a viable currency area. There's a lot of economic literature on this question. What constitutes a viable currency area? And I shall deal with that question. So the euro versus the economic literature. This table or page gives you an overview of what I want to do in this short presentation. I start with the theory of optimum currency areas, and there we have two crucial criteria: the openness of the economy. This refers to external transactions relative to domestic transactions. If you have a lot of external transactions, international so to speak, then of course a fixed exchange rate or common currency is more important. If the economy is very close, then price stability for domestic transactions is more important, and usually you cannot have both. The second, 1b, is a criterion which I proposed in the literature and which I'll explain to you. Then we shall look at point 2, similar trade union militancy and unemployment trends. That's not part of the traditional theory, but we have seen in the last few years that it is also an important factor. And then 3, similar sustainability of budget deficits. We have also seen that that is very important, at least if the no bailout clause is not respected. And fourth, I have some additional considerations, namely with regard to the preferences of the people, which may differ a lot, and I show you some evidence that they do differ. With regard to the importance of price stability, with regard to monetary budget financing, which the ECB is doing at large scale at the moment, independence of the central bank, and so on. So first of all, some figures about openness vis-à-vis the other Eurozone countries. We don't have much time. So this is exports plus imports divided by GDP. Let's look at those economies which are not really very open vis-à-vis the rest of the Eurozone. That's Malta, Italy, Greece, Lithuania, and Finland. Why is that? Well, Malta and Lithuania are small and are open in that respect, but these countries are all peripheral of in the Eurozone, and therefore they do not have that much trade with the Eurozone. So we could say that these 5 countries are not really very suitable members of the Eurozone. If there's somebody from Finland where you may have a referendum, that's an important point. The second criterion, which I proposed in 1978 in the Journal of International Economics, is the need for real exchange rate adjustment. It's really quite easy to explain, even though you need some formula. Most of you, at least the economists, know what absolute purchasing power parity is. E is the exchange rate in the currency markets. I'll call it the nominal exchange rate. P is the domestic price level, P star is the foreign price level. So the nominal exchange rate is equal to the ratio of the two price levels as an approximation. It's an arbitrage condition. If you take the P star to the other side, it really tells you that the foreign price level multiplied by the exchange rate should be equal to the domestic price level. So the goods should have the same price in both countries. Then I take dynamic purchasing power parity, which is simply rates of change of the variables. And that means that instead of having a ratio on the right-hand side, you now have a difference. And these rates of change of P are, of course, inflation rates, rates of change of the price level. Now, as I said, it's an approximation. So there are, in fact, deviations from purchasing power parity, and there are important reasons for that. Which are exogenous or maybe exogenous. You could, of course, also have a deviation from purchasing power parity due to the fact that the nominal exchange rate is adjusted, say a devaluation. The price levels don't adjust immediately, so you can also get a deviation from PPP for that reason, but that's not what interests us here. So they should be exogenous. This here is now a definition. This is the rate of change of what I call the real exchange rate. And this is simply the difference between these 3. So we now measure the deviations from dynamic purchasing power parity. Now this equation really tells you everything you need to know for the rest of the presentation. If there is a need for real exchange rate adjustment, which means that the relative prices between the baskets of goods of the two countries have to adjust. Let's say if the relative price between pears and apples has to adjust, one country produces pears and the other apples, then it is impossible to have price stability in both countries if you fix the exchange rate. If this year is 0, this year is different from 0, then these rates of change, these two inflation rates, cannot be both 0. And that means if you have this need for a real exchange rate adjustment, it is costly to have a common currency because it's impossible for both countries to have price stability. You also see in this equation that in a currency area where the rate of change of the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate, is by definition 0, you can measure the need for real exchange rate adjustment simply by comparing the two inflation rates. And that's what I shall do. I shall look at the inflation rates in different countries of the Eurozone from 1999 to now. And this tells us to what extent real exchange rates had to be adjusted, to what extent inflation price stability could not be attained in some countries, and it also tells you which countries are suitable members. I already made these 2 points. Let me remind of Milton Friedman. He made really the same point by saying that it is more efficient to implement real exchange rate adjustment by adjusting the nominal exchange rate, because that means you have to adjust only one price, namely the exchange rate. Whereas if you don't adjust the exchange rate because you have a common currency, you have to adjust the price levels. And these are many prices. It's much more costly to adjust many prices than to adjust just one, namely the nominal exchange rate. Here you see that some other criteria of optimum currency area theory, like labor mobility, diversification, similarity of industrial structure, and so on, are really all determinants of the need for real exchange rate adjustment. So this criterion which I proposed encompasses many of the older criteria and actually gives them the right weights. Okay, this was a bit difficult. Now we come to the evidence. Here we have CPI inflation measured in euros over this period here. And you can see, look at this column whole period, that the figures differ enormously. The changes in the price level differ enormously. Here we have over the whole period an inflation rate, Slovak Republic, of 72%, whereas in Germany it's only 26%. This shows you which countries are not suitable members of the euro, namely those who deviate a lot from the median or the average. So one clear result from this table is that these 4 Eastern European economies are not very desirable members of the currency union. That's the one extreme. They should not have been admitted. And at the other end, we have Germany, least desirable, France, and Finland. Now, if you take France and Germany out of the Eurozone, then the Eurozone is gone. And so this shows you how problematic the Eurozone is. Now I'm combining the openness criterion and the real exchange rate criterion in a table. Ideally, you would have an economy which is very open and which has small real exchange rate adjustment need. Large openness and small need. So this would be here. These 3 countries are acceptable members of the Eurozone. And at the other end here, you have 2 countries which are fairly closed vis-à-vis the Eurozone and which have a large adjustment need, Finland and Lithuania. they are the least desirable members of the Eurozone from an economic point of view. This is also interesting, Estonia and Slovak Republic. They are very open, large openness, so on this criterion, okay, but they also have a large adjustment need. So it's not okay. What can we do in this case? Well, it's important to have a predictable exchange rate, but the exchange rate must not be fixed. So I would suggest for those two countries a crawling peg, where you pre-announce the path of exchange rate adjustment. So you give some predictability for the exchange rate, but you are able to adjust flexibly. Now I turn to trade union militancy and unemployment trends. The countries here are ordered according to the third column, which gives you the difference between wage increases and productivity increases. So the more the wage increases exceed the productivity increases, the more militant are the unions. And you see, that was surprising to me, Luxembourg has had the highest trade union militancy over this period than Italy, Finland, France, and Belgium. The lowest militancy, Ireland and Germany. Next question, does this show off in the unemployment rate, the change in the unemployment rate? Not as clearly as I thought, but if you disregard these countries here with an E, which have an agreement with the ESM, because they had a sovereign debt crisis, and there are special reasons for the unemployment there, then the highest increase in unemployment is in fact in Luxembourg. And the second highest is in Italy. And in the Netherlands is the third, and France also has a remarkable increase in the unemployment rate. And Ireland, of course, here, which has an agreement. So what can we say here? Well, the countries with an E here would probably benefit a lot from an exchange rate change, from leaving the euro, and also here Italy and the Netherlands and Luxembourg, surprisingly. Yep. Now, different preferences with regard to price stability. There I report the results of two studies. The first study by Hayo did the following. He measured the effect of current inflation on the share of those people who consider inflation a major problem. So we have an opinion poll. People are asked, do you consider inflation a major problem among 4 possible problems? And then we regress this on the current inflation rate. And these are the coefficients which we get. And I must say the results are very much in line with my prejudices. So the highest inflation sensitivity is here in Germany, then Austria, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium. France is in the middle, and the lowest in Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. So if you have so divergent preferences among the peoples of the different member states, you are bound to get a problem. And here, another study with a different methodology, he measured the effect of the country, it's a country dummy, on the share of those who consider price stability more important than full employment. So here people were asked, do you think in the current situation that price stability is more important or full employment? And in addition, he accounted for the current inflation and the current unemployment rate. And well, the order here is very similar to the other one. These two studies really are quite consistent in their results. At the top you have Germany with a high priority of price stability over full employment, and at the bottom you have Portugal, Finland, Italy. The other countries, there are some countries missing here, as you can see if you compare. They are omitted because the coefficients were not significant. So the result here is that we have considerable differences in preferences among the people of different countries with regard to these targets of monetary policy. Now I come to the conclusion. First, the member states of the Eurozone are too different in terms of their economic structure, institutions, and policy preferences to constitute a viable currency area. The loss of the exchange rate instrument has led to inefficiencies, mutual incrimination, and turmoil. Therefore, individual member states ought to obtain the right to leave the Eurozone without leaving the European Union. And I suggest, as you did, Jacques Sapir, to break up the currency area. And how should we break it up? First of all, Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Austria. They are very similar in openness, fairly open vis-à-vis each other. They do not have a large real exchange rate adjustment need vis-à-vis each other. They have fairly similar preferences with regard to the importance of price stability and also price stability versus full employment. The only problem here is the divergent development of the unemployment rate, which of course leads to different political responses, and we see that now, of course. Then the next is the northeastern Euro, Slovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. I showed you how different these are from the rest. They have high productivity growth, they are catching up, and there's an economic theory, the so-called Balazs-Samuelson effect, which tells you why. As a result, they had to have very high inflation rates in the past, and we saw that. Then the southwestern Euro, Spain and Portugal, the southern Euro, Italy and Malta, the southeastern Euro, Greece and Cyprus. What do we do about Ireland? I think they should join rejoin the UK, and as a currency area, and seventh, Finland joining a Scandinavian Euro.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, Professor. Then I'd like to give the word to a representative of Britain, Peter Oppenheimer. I understand that he has some German heritage. He speaks excellent German as well. And apparently he's also the professor of Professor Waubel back in the 60s. He is an economist at Oxford University, specialized in financial markets, economic policy, and also has been a chief economist at Shell. So please.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to report that I agree entirely with the two previous speakers in their analysis, which is important. The people who think that the euro is not, in its present form, is not good for Europe, form not merely a politically united front, but a technically agreed front in their analysis. And I would begin just by noting briefly that Professor Waubel did not say we need 18 or 26 currencies to replace the euro. It's very important. Of course, there can be groupings of countries, sensible groupings, dependent on their mutual similarity. And I was very happy to see, even with the amusing supposition that Ireland should rejoin the United Kingdom, he still only had 7 currency areas there. Actually, I think he's probably one short, because I personally doubt whether France and Germany should be in the same currency area. But I don't want to stir up trouble in that respect. What I really want to do is to take as read the two presentations of my predecessors here and make some more general historical remarks to put them in context. The first thing I want to say is, since the case against the euro is so overwhelming on technical grounds, how on earth did, various officials, politicians, sections of public opinion, who are not stupid, It's no good saying your opponents are stupid. Somebody like Jacques Delors, for example, who in many ways was the father of the euro. How did they come to support this fantasy, this idiocy? I don't have a straightforward answer, but one part of the element, certainly, one part of the answer, is that they confused ends with means. Monies, currencies are not the end of economic activity. The end of economic activity is consumption and production. And in the middle is exchange. And the point about markets and market prices and the way they are formed is that they must be effective in allowing exchange to take place in a beneficial way, and to reconcile diversity of abilities, tastes, and preferences. And of course, every time you block the movement of a price, particularly a key price like the exchange rate, you have to be aware of the danger that you will upset the beneficial nature of economic activity by a crucial sort of blockage of the market economic mechanism. I mean, that's a sophisticated thing where I think, even intelligent and busy people can get it wrong. But I put that point before you and, as it were, leave with you the thought that one's got to remember that, unfortunately, the euro has had the support of otherwise intelligent and thoughtful people. And that is a very sad thing to observe. Now, the other aspect that I'd like to emphasize, and it's not only a confusion of ends with means, but a very mistaken view of the direction of history. There's a sort of feeling that the direction of history is towards globalization. What does that mean? Well, larger and larger units. We had the United States. Now we've got not only the United States, but China and India not far behind. These areas have populations which dwarf those of any single European country and are much more comparable and indeed sometimes much bigger than the population of the whole of Europe. And so there's a sort of psychological propensity to suppose that Europe somehow has to make itself bigger than it really is. Like the bullfrog in the famous, it has to puff itself up. And the euro, in its present extended form, is a sort of historical puffing of Europe. Now, it's actually worse than that. Before 1914, for a period of up to half a century, it was probably a little less than that, we had monetary union in Europe. It was under the name of the gold standard. But in effect, the majority of European countries west of Russia joined the gold standard. That is to say, their national currencies were immovably defined in intention and in most cases in practice, immovably defined in terms of units of gold. And people could therefore travel across Europe with no national currencies, but with a few gold coins in their pocket of whatever denomination. Many of the unifying effects of monetary union were there. Now, the reason that was possible is that under my previous criterion, the need for crucial flexibility of prices in order to effect adjustments, a lot of what Professor Faubel was referring to when he talked about real exchange rates, this could be achieved by flexibility in, above all, money wages. And this could be achieved by flexibility of money wages, not only because trade unions were not powerful if they existed at all, and therefore money wages were more readily flexible, not merely across countries, but across national economies and across different industries. Not only for that reason, but in fact labor costs formed a significantly smaller proportion of industrial output than they do today. Industrial output consisted of relatively material-intensive goods, simple machinery, transport equipment, where the ratio of even semi-processed but slightly processed metal from ores, as it were, and therefore, in effect, the role of commodities in the cost of steam engines and simple machinery, was very high compared to the cost of labor. But commodity prices fluctuate anyway, and common to all people. The share of labor in value added in the individual economies was, I say, by today's standards, very low. Today, the share of labour is enormously higher because of the much greater input of human skill, technology, and processing. We see it even in the world pattern of international trade, whereby, you know, a computer is typically produced in half a dozen different countries, all of which add a component or their own skills or the contribution determined for that particular country by the multinational corporation that organizes it. Now, this happy period of monetary union, because labor prices were sufficiently flexible to permit it, ended, broadly speaking, in 1914. Now, we know it didn't end in 1 year. It was going to end anyway in the 20th century. But there was a little catastrophe which began in 1914, which enabled us to date these things with greater, as it were, artificial precision than would normally happen in practice. Now, after World War I, one of the chief lessons that we learned from the attempts to restore economic health, and I want to say that the upset to economic health was very deep-seated. It wasn't just due to the attempts to maintain monetary union. There were demographic upsets. There was excess production of many primary commodities. There was massive... markets were horrendously disrupted by the events of World War I and those surrounding it. And my previously named sort of emphasized mechanism, where prices are the means that allow diverse human capacities and preferences to be adjusted, just couldn't work properly between the wars because the disruption was so great after the best part of a century of stability. But one thing we did learn was that there has to be a certain amount of exchange rate flexibility, as emphasized by the previous speakers, particularly Professor Faubel, in order to allow markets to equilibrate. And if I may insert, it is tragic to see how the euro is causing the repetition of antisocial policies, as it were, by mistake. I want to refer particularly to the case of Germany. One of the things that the International Monetary Fund and post-war policy institutions in other ways were set up to avoid was so-called beggar my neighbor policies. Attempts, in other words, to steal demand in a period of recession from other countries by keeping artificially low your exchange rate, which is a way of keeping artificially high the competitiveness of your industry. Now, actually, very few countries did it deliberately between the wars. They didn't have the capacity, and market forces were pushing exchange rates about. The one country which strikingly did engage in beggar my neighbor policies was Germany under Hitler. After 1933, it wasn't, of course, Hitler who did it, it was Schacht and others. They deliberately undervalued the mark in order to run trade surpluses, particularly with Southern and Eastern Europe, which helped the sort of takeover of Southern and Eastern European economies. It was one, should we say, of the lesser evils of the Nazi regime. Guess what? Today's Germany, thanks to the euro, is doing exactly the same. The euro can be seen as a mechanism for keeping the German currency undervalued to the detriment of Southern Europe and to the detriment, indeed, of the wider world economy, not only even those near the euro area like Britain, but the whole volume and health of world trade is thereby deleteriously affected. Now,
German savers.
Pardon?
And German savers.
And German savers as well. Yes, it's not even, you mean, yes, well, I wouldn't wish to say that everything that happened in Germany in the 1930s was to the benefit of the Germans themselves. I don't want to push my argument too far. But you're right, German savers are also hurt. And it seems to me logical, surely people can recognize that it is a major feature of today's European economy, namely the undervaluation of the German currency, which is reproducing what happened after 1933, surely even the most modest student of history can see that there must be something wrong with such a situation. Now, I want to stress one other point. When I said the trend of history, it's not entirely true that we are moving towards ever larger units. Yes, China is bigger than Europe, I know that, but that's really not the whole point. The point is that in parallel with the greater rigidity of money wages and the reduced possibility for movements of money wages to act as an adjustment mechanism, we have a much larger role for the state or public sector of the market economy. We talk today, we have talked since the middle of the 20th century, about the mixed economy. In the liberal economy before 1914, government expenditure and taxation was generally, except in the run-up to war, well under 10% of the gross national product. Today, in Western European market economies, we talk about figures of 40 or 50%. 4 times as great, at least 5 times as great, which constitute the volume of taxation on the one hand and public expenditure on the other. So the government is playing a much larger role. Now, you say, how does that contradict what I said? It doesn't contradict it, but it leads to a tendency for ever smaller units to want to form national nation states. We've seen the breakup of course, the Soviet Union when it marketized, Czechoslovakia. We have movements, of course, in the United Kingdom, Scotland, in Spain, Catalonia. Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, exactly. And one of the reasons, it's not just cultural and linguistic and human and social diversity, it is also the composition of the economy. People say, well, if the government is taxing and spending on my behalf up to 40% or more of my income, I would like the government to be closer, as it were, to my native base and not down the road somewhere in a big city, which I know is in some sense part of my country and I'm happy to be part of it, but it is too remote from my daily concerns. And of course, that coupled with the breakup of colonial empires has meant that in this modern world of ever greater units and ever more globalization, one countercurrent is a huge increase in the number of nation states. In not only, I mean, we see it in the United Nations, 65 when they started and nearly 200 now. And somehow Europe, in its drive for a single European identity, has got to reckon with the same kind of diversity or multiplicity of states, just as it has to reckon also with its own history, which happens, for reasons I needn't go into, and you all know, to be very diverse anyhow in languages. Look at all our colleagues here who have to sit and translate for us. In the United States, there would be no such problem. Of course, that's a good argument for making everybody speak English, which I strongly support, but concede that an exception should be made for the British, who, after all, it's not fair. Why should they have the advantage? The British should be applied to speak French. Bon, je vais maintenant parler français. Non, n'ayez pas peur, je continue en anglais, mais quand même, c'est un moyen d'équilibrer les sentiments de justice et parité. Now, I haven't much more to say, but it seems to me, as it were, self-evident that the Eurozone is clearly, as Professor Powell said, not an optimum currency area, and that it is not a sort of blow to Europe if a mistake in this respect is admitted. And instead of having one currency for 15 or 20 or 26 countries, you have 3 or 4. As it is, 3 or 4, or indeed 7 or 8, as we saw. As it is, I want to close with a prediction. Europe at the moment is a source of weakness in the world economy as well as in its own, because Europe is big enough to affect the world economy at large. Although, of course, it bears, for the most part, the negative effects of its own follies. They do extend, because Europe is a major trading unit, to the rest of the world. It's very important to stress this today, because today everybody talks about the gloom resulting from the Chinese recession, and when will the Chinese learn to become consumers and stop trying to grow entirely with export and excessive investment in a small number of areas. Let's have more domestic, as it were, consumption and also purely domestic-oriented investment. Let us not blame the Chinese for everything. Europe has been a source of weakness in the world economy for at least a decade. In China, the recession is only 2 or 3 years old in serious dimensions. And I think if we say, oh, well, it's all, we depend on China, for a start, that's a confession of failure, that Europe can't even organize its own affairs without looking to China to pull its chestnuts out of the fire, as we say in English. It is also closing one's eyes to the negative effects that, above all, the inappropriately spread euro has had on the world economy for many years before China. Another point in this same specific connection, it is no good blaming the crisis of the euro on the misbehavior of Anglo-Saxon banks. Yes, they did misbehave, and one of my views is that freedom of banks to subsidize speculation with their depositors' money should be stopped. And banks it's no good just raising their capital. They need to be much more tightly regulated and tied down. Put them in the hands of the bureaucrats. That would be very healthy. But the fact is that the banking crisis, which is another source of weakness, like China at the moment in the world economy, is again of much older vintage and quite separate from the euro. You cannot blame the problems of demand in Europe, especially Southern Europe, on the, as it were, the backlash or the spreading effects of the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. The Europe is an independent source of problem and weakness in the world economy, and we should focus on our problems at home and not seek remedies either in American bank regulation or in Chinese expansionism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So before we go to the Q&A, I will just raise a number of issues that has been mentioned that I would like to have the panel respond to. So first of all, maybe for Professor Sapir, Professor Oppenheimer mentioned that he was very surprised or sort of puzzled to the reasons why the euro was decided, given all the evidence that it couldn't work and it would crash at some point. But I would say, if you look at the incentive structure that politicians have, I mean, when the euro was decided around 1995, at that point, the borrowing rates of European countries dramatically decreased. So, and perhaps the explanation why they decided can also be important to try to explain why they refuse up till today to consider all the alternatives that we are raising here. So, but what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think that from the start, the euro has not been an economic proposition. More precisely, a lot of arguments, of economic arguments, have been developed to support the creation of the euro. But I have never seen an economist really belonging to these arguments. I'm now quite convinced that the main idea behind the euro was to push the European Union onto the road of federalization, to create a new kind of supranational states, what has been called in 2014 declaration made by Mr. Barroso in Stanford, a kind of new sui generis state. And I think that in all the discussion about the euro, there is a twist, because we are discussing the consequences, the economic consequences of the euro. But actually, most of the creators of the euro were thinking about political consequences. And I think it's extremely important to keep this in mind.
All right. Thank you. Then maybe for Professor Oppenheimer, you didn't go deep into if you would break up the euro, how would you do it? Would you like have a bank holiday? How long would it last? Like very practically, how would it look like? Maybe in two scenarios. First, if it's prepared, and second, if it's in some kind of chaotic overnight situation.
Okay. Right. 2 or 3 points in reply to that. First, any breakup of the euro is better than none. The worst thing is to keep it as it is. And I say that partly because it's true, but partly also because these things are not precisely foreseeable day to day, and there isn't one single best way of doing it. My personal preference is quite clearly impractical. It is that Germany should take the lead by announcing its exit and upvaluing then the new Deutschmark relative to the euro. That would have various beneficial effects, not least in embarrassing the German banks, which would be a general benefit, because the value of their assets would go down relative to the value of their liabilities, and the German authorities, the government, the taxpayer, instead of bailing out the Greeks, would have to bail out their own banks by enabling them to fill
What's good
the gap.
about that? What's good about that?
Sorry?
What's good about the German taxpayers bailing out German banks?
Well, in itself, there's nothing good about it. All I want to say, I would rather have the German taxpayer obliged to bail out his own bank than to bail out the government of Greece, frankly. Because at least in the case of German banks, they have the capacity monetarily to be part of a wider economy. In my opinion, the situation of Greece, while it's in a fixed exchange rate relationship with particularly Germany, but also the rest of Europe, is disastrous. And, you know, my heart bleeds for the Greek people at being subject to this. And you say, but they vote for it themselves. They want to be in the euro. That is because they do not understand the relationship between currency unity and their present economic miseries. And they associated being in Europe as loving their fellow Europeans and wanting to be loyal and wanting to be good citizens. Yes, we know all that. I'm all in favor of that. But you won't achieve it if you have a fixed exchange rate with Germany. Now, as I say, I don't think the Germans will do that. I think the second best would be to have an agreement among a small number of countries, one of the groups specified by Professor Faubel. Of course, centrally, it would be the Franco-German group, that they should take the lead as the main creators of the euro in fragmenting it. But actually, it would also be very good if any single country, whether it's Finland or Italy, or even showed that, you know, there is nothing magic about the euro. It is a device. It is a convenience. It is a means, not an end. And we can relatively simply, with the aid of a bank holiday of a few days, change our currency arrangements and our relative exchange rate. There would be an after effect. There would be disputes about the distribution of credit losses and profits, and there might well have to be litigation. People might have to go to law for a court to decide how the, as I say, the gains and losses should be distributed between parties. That is a normal part of the mechanism of a civilized society. Disputes do arise, lawyers have work to do. I know it's very easy to make fun of lawyers. They have an important role in society, and this would be a prime case where their expertise, both as counsel and as judges, would be needed. Thank goodness we have good lawyers and a system of justice to sort out these problems. This is not an argument against breaking up the euro in any degree. It is a fact that we can welcome, which makes such a breakup workable and practicable among civilized units.
And how would people pay then? You would have to go to the post office to get a stamp on your euro, or the government should print in secret to prepare this possible event?
Yeah, look, there would be some random gains and losses. People who have been sitting on, mounds of paper currency in their attics, in biscuit boxes, yes, they might benefit, because when you turn in your notes, there would be, of course, a preference. It's a nice issue how far there would be leakages across Europe. It's perfectly clear that the preference of everybody with large boxes full of euro banknotes in the attic would be to go to Germany and change them for euro. And it would be change them for Deutschmark, I beg, new Deutschmark. Now, clearly, the Germans would therefore have a problem of trying to limit this and saying that people, for example, who don't have German passports will not be eligible to exchange more than a very limited number of euro notes for Deutschmark. Okay, then there might be some enterprising German citizens with legal advisors in Panama who find a means of doing this on behalf of people from Southern Europe and splitting the differences. Look, life is full of imperfections. But major disruptions could be avoided, and minor ones we live with every day, and we would live with them in this case.
We're obviously not there yet. Professor Waubel, at the moment, especially the ECB is toying with the idea of helicopter money. And I have two questions for you. First of all, do you think that's a good idea? In what way would it disrupt savings, and would it actually then be effective to stabilize the situation? And secondly, also, maybe some of you have seen the movie Die Fälscher, which is a German movie basically detailing how the National Socialist dictatorship in Germany during the war actually managed to flood Britain with fake pounds, which had a disruption effect of some kind. Now my question is, when Hitler then thought it would disrupt the British economy, how can many economists at this point now think it's a good thing? And I generally do not see the difference between the two. But, well, maybe first Professor Waubel, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah. I don't think it would do a lot of damage, but nothing would be gained by it. It's just another way of channeling central bank money into circulation. It would not be done in the way that the central bank acquires assets in exchange. The central bank money would be given away to the citizens freely. It's a present. Now that means that there's now a gaping hole in the balance sheet of the central bank, because it has issued these liabilities but hasn't acquired any assets in exchange. So the governments would have to rebalance the balance sheet. Moreover, they would no longer get central bank profits from the ECB, so they would be short of revenue, and in order to get the revenue they would have to raise taxes, and these taxes would take away from the citizens what the citizens have gained through the helicopter money. So it's simply it's simply a method where the primary effects are later offset by subsequent adjustments, and nothing will be gained by it. And moreover, there is of course the problem that these presents to the citizens, the helicopter money, is really a way of redistribution, and the central bank should not be in charge of redistribution. That's something which parliaments should decide. So I think there's a problem with democracy if you do this.
Yes. Well, I think that the words helicopter money, of course, we know that they were coined first by Milton Friedman, but they are not very useful to describe the current situation. What the ECB could do will be, of course, to directly fund sovereign debt if this debt was linked to a major program of state or public investment. But to be able to do that, actually, and to avoid an LC effect, spillovers into speculation and things like that, we need a kind of closed system, a kind of straitjacket preventing the free movement of capital. Okay? But this is absolutely contradictory with the chart of the ECB. We have to look at the monetary and financial policy implemented in France, in Italy, just after the war until the early 70s. Actually, there is a quite important study done in Berkeley by a French researcher on that. And what it shows is the fact that you need a consistency in instrument. So, if the ECB will just introduce into circulation some amount of money without changing its rules, I think it will probably provoke more damage than it will be some good for the economy.
I just want to add a point. The fact that there is a European monetary policy being pursued by the ECB involving huge expansion of the monetary base of Europe is itself an unhealthy phenomenon and an indicator of the unhealthy effects of the euro. You see, the weakness of the European economy stems in not universal part, but in significant part, from the tying of southern European countries, the significant countries, to the Deutschmark, as it were, to Germany's currency in a fixed rate. And of course, the German authorities, this is no secret, have been opposed to the extreme monetary expansionism of the ECB, because of course it's not appropriate for them. What is appropriate for them would be an upvaluation of their currency, and if that happened, that would act as a stimulus to German consumption. German householders would be better off, and that would promote some recovery in southern Europe through the spillover effects without the need for this excessive monetary expansion. Monetary expansion by the ECB could be diminished, not completely abolished, but significantly diminished by an appropriate internal European exchange rate movement. Don't forget that because of the euro, the ECB's policy is clearly suboptimal and poses future risks for how to deal with the excessive monetary base.
All right, then before we go to the Q&A, one more small issue that we could bring up. I mean, the end of the euro has been predicted many times, and it's not. It's basically not happening, and some people say it just may continue like this and bailout after bailout, mostly through the ECB. But then we're in a world with a lot of disrupting activity, Uber, Airbnb, and some people say that actually cryptocurrencies would sort of serve as more and more as a parallel currency system to the state financial system. So as you may be right that the state financial system banks may be bureaucratized more and more, controlled more and more, given the disruptions that are happening there. People may perhaps turn more and more to cryptocurrencies, which would then eventually be private currency, but at a worldwide level. So my question is, I mean, how far-fetched is this? Or perhaps in 10, 15 years' time, may it be something that is actually much more relevant than today? So.
Well, the problem of private money and public money is very old. Actually, what a central bank is doing is transforming private money into public money. A central bank never creates by itself money. Money is ever created in specific relation between a borrower and a lender, a private borrower and a private lender. The problem is that when you have a system where the public deficit is directly funded through the central bank, a system which existed actually in the 50s and the 60s in a lot of countries. Okay. Actually, you had in the same time the two movements. First, the central bank, like a private bank, was creating private money. And in the same time, it was transforming this kind of private money into public money. Okay. So, I don't see the question of private versus public money as really relevant. But what is extremely important is to understand why we have right now such a depressed environment for investment. And if you are looking at that, if you are looking on the problem on risk, uncertainty, and the fact that private agents are right now not looking forward to a kind of quite expensive movement, you will understand why the creation of money is actually quite depressed, and why we are in a situation with very, very low inflation rate, and for some countries even negative inflation rate, and of course negative interest rates. So, back to my argument. I think that the main problem, of course, is to devise a kind of demand policy, but a kind of demand policy with direct impact onto the supply side of the economy. But to do that, the ECB or the European Commission or government will have to change fundamentally the chart of the ECB and the whole environment on which the European Union has been built since the last 20 or 25 years. So we are facing a structural problem which is taking or having the aspect of a kind of conjunctural problem, a kind of economic policy problem, but it is actually a structural problem, and till we will not change the rules and the regulation about finance, we could not exit from this situation.
Can I add on private money? Look, bitcoins is what you're thinking of, this kind of. You're not going to stop phenomena like bitcoins from appearing, any more than you're going to stop the Sicilian mafia from dominating the drugs market, or individual citizens from gambling on the horses. The danger from bitcoins will arise only if and when governments, who after all in Europe spend 40 to 50% of the national product, if governments say they will accept payment of income tax in bitcoins and begin to pay pensions in bitcoins, yes, then we have a serious danger. But so long as governments insist on using the national official money for government transactions, there is no significant danger for the next decades in people fiddling around with these fancy new instruments.
Yes, I'd like to open the floor to Q&A now. We have 45 minutes. So, yes, perhaps first Professor Starbati. If I can just ask people to only speak for a relatively short time and also always introduce themselves. And ask questions, ideally.
Joachim Starbati, Mitglied des Europäischen Parlaments. Eine Antwort möchte ich, warum man diese idiotische Konstruktion, Ihre Worte, so präferiert hat.
Well, why do you think this structure, this pretty poor structure, has been gone for? I mean, this is a question. You know, this process has been ongoing. Jacques Attali said something that's very well known when you talk about French-German relations. He said that the Germans have an atomic weapon available, which is basically the German Bundesbank. But the European monetary system isn't something that really is easy to recognize here, the predecessor to the euro. There's something that's pretty asymmetric in all of this. The Bundesbank anchors the currency, and all other central banks were forced to follow. I mean, there were national monetary policies, but they all had to follow the Bundesbank. So it's all asymmetrical because they had to follow the Bundesbank. The point of monetary union was to transform this asymmetric system into a symmetrical system, so that all the countries of the European monetary system and others that would join it would be able to be involved in deciding monetary policy. I mean, that's the point of the monetary union. The point was to try and take power away from the German Bundesbank. It wasn't about a European currency. It was about taking power away from the Bundesbank, and that was done. The Bundesbank has a vote on certain decisions, but I think that's really the point. Being members of the European Monetary Union gives members access to decision-making in monetary policy, but you can no longer use exchange rates. There's now a kind of common exchange rate. And developments in various countries have shown that this fixed exchange rate is a massive problem. It asphyxiates countries that can't improve their productivity, as Germany has done. So to a certain extent, all of that was desired at the European level, this beggar your neighbour policy. And if you look at growth rates in Germany and other countries, I mean, these differences are very clearly reflected. Our export surplus has gone from 1% to over 8% in just 15 years. So we can see that this increase in exports has produced jobs as well. Other countries import goods and are losing jobs, and that's happening in all Euro countries. I mean, what's interesting about all this is if you listen to the discussions in the European Parliament, no one seems to be aware of the situation. People say that the peoples of Europe shouldn't be sacrificed on the altar of Europe, but that's exactly what they're doing. They don't seem to understand the situation as it stands. I mean, we always hear people saying we need more, we need to do more, but no one really looks at the causes of what's going on. So an event like this, organised with our Italian colleagues, is particularly important because it highlights this idea of a mistaken exchange rate. I mean, monetary policy can't change anything if the exchange rate is wrong. Labour markets and salaries are what needs to be used to regulate the situation. But this really is a very tough regulatory mechanism. I mean, this is what you have to do if you haven't got the exchange rate lever. So slowly, over the long term, perhaps there could be some success achieved when it comes to changing this thought dictatorship, but it's going to take work. Now, Professor, I wanted to say something else. I listened to what Mr. Juncker says, and I see very clearly that he doesn't understand monetary policy at all. He doesn't know what he's talking about, knows nothing about it. And just a concluding sentence before I'm cut off. It's all well and good to have a single currency, and I think it's probably a good thing that we had a single currency when the market meltdown and the crisis happened, because otherwise we'd have had market forces, and market forces always have a massive effect on the labour market. When we've got someone who knows nothing about monetary policy who's preparing the president's Five Presidents report and determining our monetary policy, I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, you mentioned that the dominant role of the Bundesbank before 1999 was a serious political problem. I agree, and I think fear of the Bundesbank is also the main obstacle to the breakup of the euro now. If you remember the year 2010, May 2010. Why did Sarkozy want the bailout of Greece? Why he did not want the exit of Greece? The reason is that if Greece had been permitted to leave, then this would have been a very important precedent. And other countries may also have wanted to leave. And one of those countries would be Germany. And then there would be the Bundesbank again. And therefore, I think this is a good political argument in favor of having France in the Central European Monetary Union, which I recommend. Because if this is a group consisting of Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Austria, then monetary policy will not simply be made by the Bundesbank. France has an interest in stopping the current system if it can be done without return to a dominant Bundesbank. France is also paying subsidies to Greece and so on. France is a net payer in all these bailouts. And the main reason is, as I said, there should be no exit, because then Germany might want to leave. Now, if we say we don't want to leave, we want to continue the currency union with you, but we want to get rid of those countries which economically don't fit into the union, I think it's a better chance.
Sorry, just a small addition. You see, very interesting description by Professor Waubel. I would say, in this sense, the euro is based on a major blunder on the part of Mr. Sarkozy and people who think like him. Having a voice, or even two voices, on the monetary policy decision-taking committee of a central bank is in no significant way a substitute for having the freedom to alter your exchange rate. That is precisely the folly of the euro. Having a voice in the determination of a common monetary policy is nothing compared with the freedom to determine your own and alter the exchange rate accordingly.
Any other question? I think lady in the front.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you very much. I'm also part of the Italian delegation from the Five Star Movement, and I'm on the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. I would have two questions. And then, I know we're on direct and streaming here. I've also received a request that I would like to pass on at the end of my own remarks. We are constantly confronted with the problem of the impact of changing exchange rates being impossible because rates are fixed. And this has repercussions for wages, for pensions, for social policy, and you see the devastation that that gives rise to. We traveled, and my committee, to Greece to observe the effects of austerity and the social massacre that had taken place there, which is very painful and embarrassing for Europe. To all of this, we must add the problem of migratory flows, which is obviously significant. We're dealing with this in a state of emergency, and here the costs are also going to pile up, and this will have further negative consequences for Greece. We also see in member states that there's a tendency to carry out labor market policies via different reforms, which, in fact, are the apotheosis, if you will, of this form of social massacre. If you try to act over the long term on the most vulnerable categories of workers through reforms such as the Job Act in Italy, or in France, what is being proposed and discussed today, here once again, you see that there is considerable impact. There is a will to push things along one given path, which is exactly the opposite of what you have been describing and recounting up until now. And we see there's also a need to clarify some aspects of the liquidity trap. There was a question that was asked about that, and if you could give us a brief revision of that concept, what it is and what it could involve. Thank you very much.
Respond? Sure.
Okay. On 2 points. First, the liquidity trap. The best definition has been given by George Shackle when he wrote that the problem was when you were in a complete state of uncertainty, you have a direct incentive to keep your assets into the more liquid form than to invest, even if investment will give you some earnings. Why? Because this uncertainty is also reflecting onto the future earning of your investment. Now, the problem on the problem of social benefits you alluded to, and the impact of a breakup of the euro and returning onto national currency, obviously there is no direct impact onto payment made in a country. The problem is coming from what is the amount of your consumption which is imported. And the second point is, are countries from which you are importing your consumption to be depreciating or over-appreciating their currency by comparison to your own currency? Let me just give you an example with France. In France, we are computing that around 40% of the consumption is imported. Okay. It's not very surprising because a large part of the consumption is also made by services, which of course are not imported, rent for flats and things like that. In these 40%, there is only 20% coming from countries from which we could see the currency appreciating by comparison of the francs, which is making that if we are speaking of a depreciation by 20% of the franc, this depreciation will affect only 20% of the consumption. So it will be a one-shot inflation effect of 4%. This is the first point. But now you have the problem that, of course, this idea of the share of imported goods is, of course, different when you are looking onto the level, or more precisely, when you are looking onto the different part of your population. Some part of the population, have a much greater imported goods share into their own consumption. Basically, it's the upper range of the population. And the lower range have a much lower share of imported goods into their own consumption. So this is why journalists, politicians are explaining that, well, if you are breaking up the Eurozone, if you are returning onto national currency, there will be a huge inflation effect. Okay, people, explain me when you look on to the National Statistical Agency data. And what was the main problem? That these people are actually only reasoning by comparison to their own position. So this is extremely important to understand. Let me just say, in 2012, when I published Faut-il sortir de l'euro, I went onto France Culture. I had a long discussion with some journalists. And one journalist said to me, well, but if you are breaking up the Eurozone, that will make us very expensive, the fact to go for vacation in foreign countries. Actually, first, if you are going to Italy, and it is quite probable that the Italian lira will depreciate much more than the French francs, no, of course not. You will pay a much lower amount of money than in the current situation. The second point is, people, how many French people are making their vacation in foreign countries? Do you know that? Actually, less than 5%. So you are explaining me that we have to keep the euro only to protect the interest of 5% of the population. That's your acknowledgement of what is solidarity in a country? And this is a very important problem.
May I say something? The problem with Greece, in particular, is this. As you say, the poor and the unemployed and the disabled, the suffering, the beneficiaries from social assistance in Greece have very much suffered, as you say, from the restriction on government expenditure and so on. Now, if you and I then come along and say, you know what, you must devalue the Greek currency, you must go back to the drachma and devalue, this of course causes prices to rise, So everybody, including the unemployed and the poor, who have already been butchered by the cuts in social expenditure, will suffer another penalty from the rise in prices. One has to say to them, but look, this is only an immediate phenomenon. The longer run phenomenon is that Greek exports will become more competitive, the country will be more attractive to tourists, you will get jobs back, and there will be some growth. The trouble is, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a little time, whereas the penalty, the additional hardship caused by inflation is immediately visible. That is a serious problem for politicians, but it is not an argument against devaluation. On the contrary, it is an argument for not persisting with disequilibrium, but for heaven's sake, if there is a problem with the Greek economy, or indeed the British economy, let the currency decline immediately. You see, the British economy is not in many ways in good health, but to the extent that it is because we are quite used to the exchange rate of sterling, even in real terms, changing from one year to the next and from one holiday season to the next by 5%, by 10%, even more. Oh, tough luck. I'm afraid our summer holiday will cost us more, and we take it in our stride as a normal phenomenon. The problem with the Euro countries is they don't anymore take it in their stride as a normal phenomenon, and therefore they have illusions about what a disaster it would be if there were devaluation. So for psychological reasons, the longer a disequilibrium exchange rate is maintained, the harder, in some political sense, it is to get rid of it.
Okay. There was a question from Professor Lucke, I think. Yes. No, the neighbor was first. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Much of the discussion and the presentation has focused on the fact that the euro fixes the exchange rate. And I think those effects are quite well understood, and Joachim Starbatti has just outlined them once more in an excellent way. But I think what we should look at also are sort of the second round effects of our policies to save the euro from destruction. And here in particular, it is important to see what has been done to our interest rate. I would like to recall that when the communist systems, the socialist systems in Eastern Europe broke down, people argued that there were two basic deficiencies for socialist systems why they did not work. One was the centrally administered system of prices, which we just don't have in Western Europe. And the other thing was that they did not have a valid interest rate mechanism, so that sort of the intertemporal allocation did not function well in the socialist economies. Now we have precisely this situation now too. We have an interest rate which is virtually zero, actually not only in the Eurozone, but also elsewhere in the world economy, so it's not quite clear how much of that is actually effect of the euro, but it is certainly reinforced by the euro rescue policies that we have. And this interest rate of virtually zero leads to consumption now being increased at the expense of consumption in later periods. So we have in an aging society, as Europe unfortunately is, and some countries like Italy and Germany in particular are very strongly aging, the problem that we have lots of consumption in the present and very little incentives to save for future consumption, so that we run into huge problems in the future with our old population and with little amounts of saving. So my question is, first, should we not focus much more on the problems of the destroyed interest rate mechanism, which will lead to a new crisis, which is perhaps then not baptized a euro crisis, but it will perhaps be baptized pension crisis or whatever, but which has some roots at least in the Eurozone. Second question, there's some things, I think, which we don't understand well. And one of these things is the development of the inflation rate. We have an immensely expansive monetary policy in the Eurozone, but we do not have inflation. Actually, we have deflation in some of the crisis countries like Greece. And deflation actually makes the debt burden even harder to bear for Greece than inflation would make that. Now the question is, why actually is it not possible to achieve at least a modest degree of inflation in the Eurozone, despite of the fact that we print monies by the billions, now 80 billions of euros each month? Why is that possible, and how much does this have to do with our system of Target 2, which indicates that we run into a new crisis because we witnessed since the middle of 2014 that the Target 2 discrepancies are on the rise again in the Eurozone after they have calmed down for about 2 years. But then they are now on the rise again, and we see that the crisis countries like Italy and Spain in particular, have rising target obligations in the Eurozone system. So these are the questions I would like to pose.
All right. Thank you. Perhaps Professor Vogel, especially the question regarding CPI inflation, we should call it perhaps. Why don't we see a lot of consumer price increasing in the stats? Is it because there's deflationary forces which are even bigger, or what's your take?
Yeah, I'm puzzled myself. We do, of course, know that the demand for money depends on the interest rate, and if the interest rate is low, then people want to hold more money. And to some extent, we can explain the current experience in this way. So this is demanded money, and therefore it's not inflationary. But I believe that at some point, if we continue this policy, the inflation rate will rise. But I'm not sure that this will solve many problems.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the pension crisis, the impending pension crisis, and the role of the common currency in making it worse?
Well, the pension crisis consists in the fact, as it were, insofar as there is one, that today's younger members of the population are not saving enough to pay for their own pensions in the future. And that's a very nice question, because, I mean, logically, you should say, if the prospects are that the economy will not grow or grow at a much slower rate than previously thought, that, well, first there has to be publicity to warn people against the danger of having an inadequate income in old age. Or, of course, or if that doesn't work, the governments would have to consider somehow levying larger pension contributions, which of course is deflationary in turn and will again encourage it. The problem is that the savings propensity at the moment, paradoxically, is excessive, because you say there's too much consumption relative to investment, because investment is so low. And then the danger is that the government will be moved to reinforce this rather than countering it by levying larger pension contributions. I think the only comment I can make is that it shows the need to try to reduce the rigidities in the economy, which are discouraging investment. And there's no easy way. You can't order people to invest because it is liable to be wasteful. But all rigidities are desirable, including existing rigidities of the exchange rate. And although it won't in itself solve the problems of an aging population, at least it would undo one of the log jams, which is causing, as it were, a prolonged stagnation in the economy. I think we, in general, we mustn't get ourselves paralyzed by looking at the demography, because demography really is a separate problem. I wish I could say that once we get rid of the euro, people will have more children. I don't think that can be a guaranteed effect. There are limits, but it doesn't help, I think, good decision taking to be, as it were, mesmerized by the demographic problem which exists anyhow. So that's not a very rich answer to your question, because I don't think there is one.
Okay, maybe Professor Sarbati, you had a small comment regarding, and then I will...
Yes. I would like to have a clarification here, make one. We don't have any inflation of consumer prices at present. We have it with real estate prices and also with the rates on the stock market. We've seen this with government borrowing as well, and you have to look at the rates there. And we see inflation also in works of art recently. And so you will only have inflation in consumer prices when unions are active. We talked about the Phillips curve. There, we've heard that when you have this difference between productivity and wage rates, and that becomes bigger, that will have effects on consumption prices. And so when you see the differences between productivity and wage rates, you see that's very small. In Germany, we have unions who have a very prudent, reserved position and have had. And then when you look over at Greece or at Spain, there you see their adaptation processes, which take place via the labor market. And so it's quite clear. What is being produced here is inflation with those prices and not with the prices of consumer goods.
Yes, gentlemen.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm Paavo Väyrynen from Finland. I'm from the ALDE group. I'm working for the Fix-It in Finland. I have two questions concerning the break-up of the Eurozone. Mr. Sapir spoke about the coordinated break-up. I can tell you that 2 years ago in Finland, there was a working group chaired by Professor Kanniainen, which proposed that we should take in use in all Eurozone countries the national currencies. We would have the euro and the national currencies. This is the model I proposed and supported in 1995 in the European Parliament. I did not accept euro as a single currency. I accepted it as a common currency, besides the national currencies. What would be your comment, Mr. Sapir, on this proposal? How would it work? Secondly, Mr. Faubel spoke about the 7 currencies. I guess in your model there would be 7 central banks. But what would be the solution on the European level? Would we have a European exchange mechanism or ECU in some form? What would be the form of coordination on the European level?
Well, the debate on the common currency against the single currency has been, of course, extremely important in France too. The problem is that, theoretically, we could certainly imagine a system where we will use the euros for any transactions, any trade between the Eurozone and the rest of the world, and inside the Eurozone, use national currencies. But the implementation of such a system is extremely difficult. And by the way, without a system of capital controls, at least, this system will not achieve the stability required to function. So I think that the common currency with national currency is theoretically a good idea, but I'm not seeing this system to function. And let me go back to my personal experience. I was greatly involved into Russian transition. And in 1991, 1992, there was a lot of debate about could we keep the Soviet rubles, or do we keep the Soviet rubles and have, in the same time, some national currency? Actually, you acknowledge very quickly that to make this system working, you need a degree of cooperation between central banks extremely high. And actually, it is the simplest solution which won the day. And the simplest solution is to go back to national currency.
You go first.
Yeah, the question was what exchange rate regimes would we have between the 7 currencies? I did already indicate that for those currency areas which are very open vis-à-vis the Central European euro, it would be useful to have a predictable exchange rate, for example, for the Baltic states. And nevertheless, they would need an adjustable exchange rate because of their productivity growth. And I think there the best system is a crawling peg. Crawling peg is a gliding parity, which is pre-announced. It depends very much also on whether the real exchange rate changes which have taken place in the past follow a trend or not. If they follow a trend, and that is the case for most of them, then a crawling peg would work very well. If there's no trend, then you may need some sort of managed float or some intermediate regime.
I would just say it's not clear to me for whose sake one would have a common currency if one has national currencies. Clearly, national governments, I assume again, would make their own payments and accept payment of taxes by the citizens only in their national currency. Then the question arises, what determines the quantity of the common currency? Who controls it? As we already said, as Professor Sapir said, if you want a consensus mechanism, it requires a sophisticated and indeed unpredictable degree of control or cooperation among the member states. And it seems to me it would degenerate into a kind of Bitcoin situation. Much better for those who are outside the European zone or the Eurozone, but trading with the Eurozone, to decide for themselves what working balances they wish to hold. I mean, if I, say, live in Britain, which doesn't have the euro, which has sterling, but I typically, should we say, take holidays on the continent of Europe, then I will have a working balance in euros, and if there were several currencies, I might have working balances, as it is. Matter of fact, I've just thought of one, the Swiss franc. I also have the working balance in Swiss francs at home, not big, because I can buy it any time. All right, maybe in some future hypothetical situation, I or my children would similarly have working balances in Finmarks and in Deutschmark. It's not a disaster if instead of operating with 2 currencies, you operate with 5. You can buy and sell, and you can have working balances. Where's the problem? Who has the benefit, as opposed to the anxiety, from running a common currency alongside national currencies? Let individual economic units, households or factories, make their dispositions with working balances in different currencies. That's not a disaster.
Another proposal which once was done in the 90s was that, okay, if you want one currency for Europe, all the other countries can just implement the relatively stable Deutschmark. But that was never, there was not much interest in that. But Professor Henkel, you had a comment?
I have been sort of listening here, but I wanted to reflect on this Finnish contribution. Earlier I said in my opening remarks that it was our Alpha's position to suggest Greece leaves, and in exchange he would sort of forego the credits the guarantees and so on, and that we are the only political force in Europe which has made that proposal so far. However, I do believe that there is a country where a departure from the euro is even easier, and that's Finland. And I tell you why. I have had a discussion with Václav Klaus some years ago. He told me how he disengaged the Czech from the Slovak crown. And he described to me, he was then Minister of Finance or Minister of Economy or whatever, or Prime Minister. He described to me that this was done over a weekend and that no Czech person remembers even the date. He said that to demonstrate that it was so smooth that the date was not anymore in the collective memory of the people. Okay. And I think this goes also for Finland for two reasons. Number one, the Finnish citizens and the Finnish politicians could easily point out to the real difference between the development, economic development in Finland as compared to their neighbor in Sweden, which kept control of their own currency. And you heard earlier from two different sources how well Sweden did without the euro. And the second thing is you could do it like they did in Czechoslovakia at that time, that you announce it on a Friday evening. You close the borders. You just say you're not allowed to bring any currency out or in. You declare a bank holiday on a Monday. And on Tuesday, you have your own currency back. And therefore, I am looking forward to the result of this referendum in Finland and what the parliament does with it. But it might be a very interesting case which nobody has right now on its radar screen.
Okay. I think we have time for one, max two more questions. Yes.
Yeah. Is that better? Yes. Thank you. We've heard a number of very compelling arguments why the euro really makes no economic sense in the context of the current currency area. But there are a number of political factors, of course, which prevent economic sense from prevailing. The first and most important is probably that Germany really belongs to the psychiatrist's chair. Secondly, I think, and that's probably a slightly more provocative statement, I mean, it seems there's a regrettable tendency in France to accept a certain amount of pain if there's a good reason to assume that Germany will be pain too. Thirdly, most of Central and Eastern Europe has once again decided to follow Germany into perdition. What in these circumstances, I mean, looking at the economics of it is of course one thing, but what could be the economic impetus for that could lead to an economic or to a breakup of the euro or a fragmentation of the eurozone? That's really my question.
All right, something which Professor Sapir touched. I understood you think even this year already. Of course, there's the Greek issue, but who wants to react on that? In terms of timing, it can be hard to predict. When will the trouble start again? And
no, I don't know when it'll start again, but I thought the question was, what could be the when you say what could be the impetus to break up, you mean what new crisis?
No, I mean, there's obviously an enormous political will to prevail over economic laws. So what could be the economic catastrophe almost that could erode that will?
I don't think it's a question of catastrophe. The question is something you and I were discussing earlier, a kind of reluctance to dislodge the status quo. I mean, it seems to me if you take the case of Italy, there is some real debate about whether it wouldn't be better for Italy to go back, you know, to a new lira. The trouble is that lethargy or inertia, or the attitude of, oh, well, we've been through so much hassle over this politically, and yes, the economy's not doing very well, but nobody's starving. You know, there isn't enough visible benefit. By visible benefit, I mean no politician dare stand up and say, if we devalued the currency in 5 years' time, our gross domestic product would be 20% higher than it is today, after we've had zero growth for a decade. Now, I believe that is the order of magnitude of benefit, but no politician dare stand up and have his words recorded so that if the benefit is not 20 but only 12%, he'll be accused in 5 years of having told, it's easier to be quiet, particularly when the politicians are not among the worst paid members of society.
Thank you very much for that last statement. I'm afraid we'll have to cut it off here, but we have the whole rest of the day to discuss these things. We start again at 2 p.m. Sharp, so I look forward to see you there.
Sharp.
And would like to thank the members of the panel very much for their contribution.